The next component we're going to be adding is the cell object loader. Now remember, the primary cell object subcontroller is actually responsible for getting the objects to the world, and it does this by attaching the objects to the cells that the world sends the subcontroller, and it's also responsible for processing objects that are no longer used by the world. So again, this non-pooling version is simply going to destroy those objects, and this means that when the world sends a request to the primary subcontroller for objects, those objects will need to be loaded into the scene. So in order to actually load objects into the scene, we rely on the cell object loader. So to create our loader, create another object. We can call this one cell object loader. And if we go to component dynamic loading kit, cell object loaders, we'll see that there's three types. I'm just going to use the prefab loader for now. The scene loader loads scenes using application.loadLevelAdditive, and the async scene loader, which is pro only, uses application.loadLevelAdditiveAsync. The prefab loader is simply going to use the instantiate method to load the prefabs from a folder called resources. And for some reason my project is not wanting to respond properly, so the prefab loader is simply going to load these prefabs using the instantiate method. So if you're using a prefab instantiator, you will need to make sure that your objects are in a folder called resources. You need to make sure that your prefabs are deactivated as well. As you can see, there's only a single option on our prefab instantiator, the instantiate frequency. So when the objects need to be loaded into the scene, the subcontroller doesn't just send a single object, it sends a list of objects. And we could use the instantiate method to load all those objects in a single frame, but that would not be very performant. So instead, we instantiate a prefab and then wait a period of time and then instantiate the next one, wait another period of time, and so on. So this instantiate frequency is just indicating that period of time. So 0.3 indicates that we'll instantiate the prefab, wait 0.3 seconds, and then instantiate the next prefab. Once you've added your cell object loader, actually, you know what, I want to go over those other cell object loaders. So in order to use the scene loader component, you're going to need to generate your scenes, which you can do using the generate scenes tool, which you can find under assets, dynamic loading kit, generate scenes. I'll go over how to use this tool in another video. The one thing I want to note here is that you will need to assign a tag to your objects, which indicates that those objects are newly loaded and have not been attached to a cell. So for example, I've created a tag called unbound, and in your scene loader, on your scene loader component, you'll need to specify that tag. The visible layer is simply the layer that the object will be moved to once it has been correctly positioned. This is needed because the objects in the scenes have to be activated in order to be found by the scene loader component. Unlike the prefab instantiator where your prefabs had to be deactivated, the scene loader components, both this one and the async, require the objects to be activated. So if we put them, if they started on the default layer, which is visible, then the player would see those objects when they're not positioned correctly. In order to avoid that, we stick them on a layer that's not visible to the camera, and then once they're positioned correctly, we move them to a layer that is visible. So this layer here is the layer that is visible. Usually you can just leave that to the default value. Now the async scene loader has another option, which is the load priority. This is simply the amount of resources that Unity will devote to loading your scenes in the background. So if you specify low, then your objects are going to be loaded more slowly, but you're going to probably get better performance. So just go ahead and check out some of these different options and see what works best for your game. So we'll just use our prefab instantiator for now. Once you've added that component, we need to go back to our primary SolObject subcontroller and add our SolObject loader to that field. And that'll end the configuration of the SolObject loader, and our primary SolObject subcontroller is also configured now. In the next video, we'll take a look at the final component, which is the component manager. Thanks for watching.